Thomas found the hidden vials under the princess's bed, and suddenly her mysterious illness made perfect, terrifying sense. He stared at the small glass container cradled in his palm, as if it held a secret that could change everything. The room was silent, except for the soft breathing of the Princess Leary, a Veldraken, who lay on the ornate golden bed nearby. Her copper hair fanned out around her head like a halo, and she watched him with curious amber eyes. "Thomas," she called softly when he straightened from under her bed, where he had found the vials hidden behind the post. "You're new," he nodded, trying not to let his surprise show on his face as he stepped towards her bedside in full view. Thomas bowed deeply and said, "Yes, Your Highness. I am Thomas Miller." She smiled weakly, but it was a genuine attempt at politeness more than anything else. She asked, "You don't seem afraid of me." Thomas shrugged off the question with an easy smile that didn't quite reach his warm brown eyes. "Should I be?" Princess Leary laughed, her laugh as delicate and fragile as petals in spring rain before she doubled over into a painful fit of coughing. "Are you well enough to speak?" he asked gently while placing a hand on the bedside railing for support, so that it didn't look like he was hovering too closely. He noticed how pale she had become since his last visit just 2 days prior, even with all the healer's efforts. She waved off his concern and managed another weak smile through her short breaths once they stopped coming in waves. "I am fine for now." He nodded to acknowledge, but didn't believe it fully. No one else seemed able to find a cure despite numerous attempts by some of the finest medical practitioners across several star systems, including alien doctors. Leary pointedly ignored the coughing fit and instead turned her attention back to him with more seriousness. "Why, are you not afraid?" Thomas sighed softly in consideration. He had heard many stories about how royal families treated their servants like they were nothing, a few whispers of abuse here or there by the other staff members who hadn't worked closely enough yet. But he knew better than that from his time in service and the first-hand experience dealing with illness at home. "I've seen worse things out there," Thomas said honestly. "I grew up on a frontier colony where fear didn't do anyone any favors." She raised an eyebrow ever so slightly, as if impressed by this answer, before nodding slowly, accepting it for what it was worth. They shared another moment of silence, broken only by her slight sniffle. He returned his focus back to the task at hand, knowing he needed to clean efficiently without disturbing her further. Carefully brushing away dust from shelves and polishing silverware around her room, Thomas noticed how much cleaner everything seemed compared to past visits. Perhaps out of respect for someone so ill, he continued sweeping until eventually reaching under her bed where his earlier discovery had been made. While cleaning that area thoroughly, he found 2 small glass vials tucked behind the heavy wooden frame. One was half empty, while its companion lay completely empty and slightly more worn down from use. Their smooth surfaces glinted dully in scattered light, which seemed oddly out of place here among all else being meticulously clean around him. The bottles were unmarked but held some sort of thick liquid inside. Thomas knew better than to leave them untouched, as that would be irresponsible given what had just happened earlier with her coughing fit and illness worsening over time. Yet, at the same moment, he wasn't sure who these belonged to, or someone else trying something sinister. His curiosity got the best of him, because despite knowing it was out of line to do so without permission first, Thomas pocketed one of the vials as carefully as possible while keeping his movements inconspicuous from her bedridden view. His heart raced slightly at this breach, but he reminded himself that doing nothing would be worse and not help anyone. After finishing up quickly with all other duties assigned for today's schedule, Thomas bid Princess Leary a quiet farewell before leaving the room as swiftly yet discreetly as possible without drawing attention to himself or what just occurred here. He made sure everything looked neat and tidy again once completed, hoping no one else had noticed his actions. That night back in his quarters, after completing all duties for today's shift, Thomas took out those vials from under a pillow. He kept them hidden safely inside, while making sure nobody could see him doing so earlier, if they were walking past or checking up on things behind the scenes. He unscrewed one carefully and examined its contents closely once more. The sweet yet wrong smell hit his senses immediately, as soon as it was opened, further honey-like, but with a metallic undertone that hinted at something far less natural than what appeared to be present initially. His mother had experienced similar symptoms before being treated for severe poisoning long ago, when Thomas first joined the palace service. Recognizing signs of such now brought back painful memories, along with knowing exactly how lethal and sneaky poison could actually be. Without hesitation, he sealed it up once more and tucked them away safely in a drawer marked private, where no one else would likely look, even if snooping around. He knew that tomorrow morning he'd need to figure out the next steps carefully, without causing panic or drawing unnecessary suspicion, because something felt very wrong here about all of this. And so Thomas decided right then and there, if anyone was trying poison Princess Leary, that in order to harm her health further, like some kind twisted game, they would have a new opponent who wouldn't back down from fighting against such attempts. Thomas Miller's heart pounded as he stepped into his small, dimly lit quarters after a long day of serving in the grand halls and chambers of Emperor Draken's palace. His eyes darted around nervously before settling on the drawer marked private, where he had hidden the vials from under Princess Lyria's bed. He pulled them out cautiously, holding one up to the sparse light filtering through his window. The liquid inside was a deep crimson with an unnerving metallic sheen. The memory of what it could do lingered heavily in Thomas's mind, a stark reminder of the dangers that lurked behind closed doors within this majestic palace. It had been months since Princess Leary first showed symptoms, and despite countless healers' best efforts, her condition continued to worsen. But tonight was different. Tonight, he wasn't just a servant anymore, he was on a mission driven by something more profound than his initial instinct to help, something that gnawed at him from the depths of injustice and compassion. The next morning broke with an unusual chill in Thomas' quarters. He dressed quickly in his uniform, trying not to dwell too much on what lay ahead, but knowing he could no longer ignore it either. His path would lead him through the grand hallways adorned with intricate tapestries depicting ancient tales of dragonkind and their human allies, towards Princess Leary, his chambers where her life teetered precariously. As usual, Thomas entered to find Princess Leary lying weakly on her bed, her long copper hair spilling across pillows that seemed too bright against the somber reality of her deteriorating health. The warmth in her amber eyes faltered as she coughed softly into a lace handkerchief, the only sign remaining of what once was an energetic princess. "Good morning, Thomas Leary," he greeted him with a small smile, though it didn't quite reach those tired eyes. "Has there been any news?" She hoped against hope that perhaps this day would bring something different from yesterday's despair. Thomas' heart tightened in response to her hopeful tone, but he shook his head gently, trying not to dash all of her fragile optimism. Instead, he nodded towards the bedside table, where a small bottle sat next to various other jars and potions prescribed by Kithra, their esteemed royal physician. "Princess Leary, I need you to trust me on this," Thomas began carefully, as she watched him with a curious tilt in her head. "Of course, Thomas," she replied softly, though there was an undercurrent of wariness now that he couldn't ignore. Her voice remained steady despite the tremor of uncertainty beneath it. "Just tell Kithra you need more time to rest before today's visit, if you can manage it without causing too much fuss," Thomas continued gently but firmly. "There's something important I think we should look into." Leary had nodded, her eyes darkening slightly as understanding flickered across them. She trusted Thomas implicitly. He had become not just a servant in these months of illness and uncertainty, but someone she could confide in about the strange dreams that seemed to echo reality, or the sudden moments when she felt almost completely well only to falter again shortly after. "Thank you, Leary," he whispered with gratitude in her voice. She knew what he was doing, trying to protect her from something potentially dangerous, and it warmed her heart even more than his words ever could. Meanwhile, Kithra made his way through the palace's winding corridors, carrying a familiar vial of crimson liquid under the guise of another visitation for Princess Lyria's ongoing treatment. His steps were brisk and sure despite the growing whispers behind closed doors about both his efficiency in treating the princess and her persistent illness that refused to abate. Arriving at the grand oak doors leading into Princess Lyria's chamber, Kithra paused briefly before stepping inside, where Thomas had already discreetly taken care of arranging everything for a smooth visitation. He nodded silently towards Mira as she entered from another doorway, carrying trays with various herbal concoctions and other medicinal items needed to treat what everyone believed was merely an incurable disease. Mira, his friend since childhood days on the frontier colony where Thomas grew up, offered him a knowing glance that made Kithra's grip tighten slightly around the bottle of poison medicine. He couldn't afford any slip-ups now. Too much was at stake for this plan to fail, just because of one servant girl who had more guts than sense. "Princess Lyria is resting," Mira informed them softly, setting down her tray beside Kithra's preparations with practiced ease. Despite the nervousness she felt gnawing inside, her eyes flicked towards Thomas, whose presence was comforting but also concerning at this moment. Kithra approached Princess Lyria's bedside and began discussing treatment options while carefully pouring drops from his vial into her water bottle without drawing undue attention to himself or breaking protocol in any way that might alert others of what he truly intended. Through all the formalities, Thomas watched with keen eyes, noticing every little detail about this routine visitation, including how Kithra's hands trembled slightly when pouring those drops. Once Kithra left, after his usual 3 times a day ritual, Mira quickly leaned over to speak in hushed tones beside her friend. "Thomas, there's something I need you to see," she murmured urgently, while checking that no one else was within earshot or sight. She led him down a hallway towards the medical storage room, where they had been gathering evidence for days now without drawing unwanted attention. Inside, shelves lined with various bottles and jars filled their small space like sentinels of ancient knowledge yet to be unraveled fully by anyone but those who dared challenge them daily. Under this roof, Mira pointed discreetly toward several vials hidden near the back corner, where she had been collecting proof through countless late nights spent watching Kithra's movements from afar. "There," whispered Mira, her voice barely audible over the quiet hum of palace life outside their door. "He keeps replacing them regularly, but they are always exactly alike and come with strange payments that none have seen." Thomas took one vial out gently while glancing at its label briefly before tucking it away carefully into his pocket for further investigation later, when there wouldn't be any risk involved doing so openly within these walls. Suddenly, Footsteps echoed outside their door, making both Thomas and Mira freeze instantly. The sound of approaching boots grew louder, until they stopped abruptly just beyond their threshold, signaling the arrival of another servant who was meant to bring fresh water bottles or replace empty ones elsewhere in the palace grounds. "Quickly," whispered Mira, her eyes wide with anxiety as she urged Thomas towards a hidden trap or underneath one corner of the storage room that led directly into an underground passage system used rarely nowadays, except by those needing stealth and secrecy above all else. They slipped inside just moments before whoever was out there began knocking on their door, loudly demanding entry. Back in her chambers, Princess Leary awaited anxiously while Kithra prepared another dose of medicine for her next scheduled visitation later today. After Thomas had left to check something important with Mira earlier this morning regarding his suspicions about why she continued getting worse instead of better despite all efforts put forth by healers across realms, Leary couldn't help but feel a strange sense of relief knowing someone trusted cared enough not just to offer sympathy or pity, but actually try solving the unsolvable mystery behind her illness. Yet doubts still lingered. Was it really possible for something so sinister to be hidden within this supposedly safe haven? As if reading her thoughts directly from across the room, Kithra approached with a serene expression masking whatever turmoil might lie beneath. He poured carefully into another vial that matched all others given Princess Leary daily without ever failing in consistency despite whispers hinting otherwise. "Drink up," he instructed warmly yet firmly while offering it to her gently within its small glass cup perched delicately against her fingertips. "You will feel better soon enough, my dear." Leary had nodded softly as she accepted the drink, holding back a shiver from the metallic aftertaste lingering on her tongue once more despite how carefully hidden such things seemed meant to remain forever unknown. Meanwhile, outside, Thomas and Mira hurried through dimly lit passages beneath palace grounds until reaching an exit leading directly into garden areas where fewer people roamed during off hours like these. Here, they could breathe easier momentarily while discussing next steps needed urgently before anyone else noticed their absence from duties assigned elsewhere today, amongst others oblivious to potential dangers lurking closer than imagined. "We need proof linking Kithra with someone who has a motive," Thomas stated firmly once settling onto a small stone bench surrounded by blooming flowers, providing slight cover against prying eyes, if any happen upon this secluded spot unannounced. "Who stands to gain from Princess Leary's continued decline?" Mira thought hard while glancing around nervously before answering softly, after some consideration, "Do careful not to raise suspicions too quickly despite urgency pressing heavily between them both now more than ever." "Duke Forath," she breathed out finally with certainty in her voice mirroring Thomas's own conviction once finding out about such secret dealings earlier this week. "He's Emperor Draken's younger brother and heir apparent. If something were to happen suddenly to either of them currently ruling." Thomas nodded grimly at that realization settling heavily over him, knowing full well how dangerous it would be bringing such allegations forward without solid evidence backing every word spoken aloud now or future. "Duke Forath has been receiving secret payments from Kithra," Mira continued hurriedly while checking her surroundings once more for any immediate danger lurking nearby undetected. "I overheard one servant delivering money to him privately last week." Thomas' eyes flashed with determination as he pieced together the puzzle emerging now clearly before them amidst shadows cast by walls hiding far too many secrets until this moment. "Thank you, Mira," Thomas said gratefully, while gently squeezing her shoulder in support and encouragement for facing such risks alongside him despite all odds stacked against their chances of success. We need to find more proof linking these payments directly back to those vials before going public. With renewed resolve shining brightly behind every word shared between them here, they stood up once more, ready together to face whatever challenges lay ahead, in uncovering truth buried deep beneath surface appearances throughout this grand palace filled with power and secrets alike. And so ends Chapter 2 exactly as described before any further action unfolds leading into next chapter's events, continuing our story's progression towards resolution amidst danger lurking ever closer. Thomas Miller wiped his sweaty palms on his servant's uniform, trying to steady himself as he approached the grand throne room of Emperor Draken's palace. The air was thick with tension. Whispers and hushed conversations filled the vast chamber, while guards stood tall at every corner, their eyes scanning for any sign of insubordination or dissent. The emperor sat high on his golden dais, flanked by noble advisors in elaborate robes and armors polished to a reflective shine. He was an imposing figure, even from afar, scales of deep crimson gleaming under the chandelier's light, thick horns curling gracefully above piercing amber eyes that seemed to see through every soul within the room. Thomas took another deep breath as he entered the chamber, unnoticed at first, slipping between the pillars and archways until finding a small niche near an unattended side exit. He glanced over his shoulder nervously, confirming no one had seen him slip in among all those bustling around for morning council meetings or private audiences with high-ranking officials. Mira caught his eye from across the room. She nodded encouragingly before ducking into a nearby storage closet to avoid drawing attention their way just yet. Thomas swallowed hard and turned back towards the center of activity, steeling himself as he stepped out of hiding, fully exposed now amidst crowds who murmured at sight of an uninvited attendee like him. He strode purposefully forward despite his heart pounding against ribcage with each step. The noise of court proceedings dimmed momentarily around him until it was almost a buzzing hum far away, while everyone's gazes shifted towards this unexpected human intruder making himself so boldly present before their ruler without permission granted or invitation issued first. "Your Majesty," Thomas called out loudly yet respectfully, ensuring every word carried weight and meaning through the space of vast chamber despite distance between them. "I accuse royal physician Kithra of poisoning Princess Lyria." The room fell into eerie silence as all eyes snapped to him in shock, guards tensing with weapons drawn towards formality, breaking protocol violation. They witnessed before them nobles murmuring amongst themselves speculations and rumors long held back for fear of repercussions now erupting into open disbelief or accusation. Emperor Draken himself stood swiftly from his throne, scales darkening ominously as fury surged through him. Smoke curled upward from nostrils, invisible plumes amidst rising temperature within air suddenly thick with threat. "You," he roared out across the hall, voice echoing like thunder crashing overhead. "How dare you accuse a member of my court such slander?" Kithra stepped forward hastily beside Day. Were Emperor stood ready for confrontation brewing now openly before all present here today. Her scales gleamed ominously under chandelier's glow as she glared at Thomas coldly. "Insolent human," she spat out, venom dripping from each syllable delivered with chilling precision, aimed directly toward him alone amidst this gathering of nobles. Thomas met her gaze squarely, even while knowing full well how dangerous a situation had become within few seconds following his bold declaration aloud here. Under such scrutiny, eyes watching closely now over every single move made next, either by him or others present throughout Grand Chamber today. "I have evidence," Thomas replied calmly, trying to maintain composure despite palpable tension building around him, visibly escalating rapidly toward breaking point soon. "Seize this insolent servant," Emperor commanded guards without hesitation, his voice echoing again amidst hushed whispers spreading through crowd forming now around niche where Thomas stood isolated against many foes surrounding him, all too eager to see consequences fall swiftly upon head dared defy authority unchecked. Until now, Thomas felt strong hands grabbing at arms before realizing had been surrounded quickly. Several heavily armed soldiers now closed in tight to prevent any escape route possible under current circumstances, while Emperor continued shouting orders angrily amidst crowd growing ever larger, gathering closer still around central figure trapped here helplessly between two opposing forces battling fiercely for control over situation brewing dangerously out of hand. But just as Thomas was dragged forcibly toward center stage where he would be made example before all present gathered here today, a voice cut through the chaos, a melodious sound that brought an abrupt halt to everyone's movements. It was Princess Leary, standing on her balcony above with eyes wide in alarm and concern for this human whom she had grown strangely fond of despite his humble status. "Father," she shouted suddenly down below towards dais, where throne sat empty now awaiting return from one momentarily distracted by unexpected turn events took here within moment, threatening to spiral out control completely. "Wait, let him speak." Thomas looked up in shock, as did every other person present throughout Grand Chamber at sight of Princess Leary, standing there weakly but resolutely despite her illness visibly worsening month after another under mysterious circumstances not explained clearly until now today. Amidst this dramatic revelation breaking all tradition longest, ending within palace walls, Emperor Draken paused, smoke still curling from nostrils, yet scales slowly lightening back to normal hue as he turned his gaze upward toward balcony where Princess Leary stood framed against morning sun filtering through large windows behind her. "You spoke, daughter?" he asked quietly. After momentary silence, filled air, now thick with tension hanging heavily over everyone gathered here awaiting outcome unfolding next amidst drama playing out before them all. Leary had nodded weakly despite effort required for such simple motion given current state health deteriorating rapidly under mysterious conditions plaguing palace these past few months, without clear resolution found until now today. "Father," she spoke softly but clearly, even from distance separating balcony from ground far below where court convened here awaiting judgment passed upon Thomas accused unjustly yet bearing evidence proving otherwise entirely. "Very well, human servant," Emperor Draken said finally, after a long moment considering both his daughter's plea and the audacious claim made by this lowly member of palace staff. "You have 1 minute to prove your accusations." Thomas's heart pounded as he was dragged toward a nearby pillar where chains awaited, ready to secure him until his fate could be decided. The courtyard of the Grand Palace had turned into an arena of tension and suspicion, with guards stationed at every corner, their expressions stern and vigilant. "Seize this insolent servant," Emperor Draken commanded again as Thomas's captors yanked hard on his arms, causing a sharp pain that shot up through his wrists. But then came the unexpected voice from above, a soft yet commanding tone that made everyone pause momentarily in shock. "Father, let him speak." Thomas looked up to see Princess Leary standing gracefully on her balcony high above them all, sunlight filtering through intricate designs of stained glass windows behind her, casting a surreal glow over her delicate figure. Her copper hair was loosely tied back, and even from this distance, he could sense the weariness in her eyes despite their warmth towards him. The Emperor's scaly hand clenched tighter into fists as his attention snapped upward to where Leary stood regally against the backdrop of vibrant colors dancing across stone walls. "You spoke," Draken growled through gritted teeth after a momentary silence filled with anxious anticipation and uncertainty among those gathered below. Leary nodded slightly, her breath catching visibly, but maintaining composure for all who watched from beneath. "Father," she said softly yet clearly, enough to be heard by everyone present within the courtyard's walls, "let him speak." The Emperor hesitated for what seemed like an eternity before finally nodding grimly. "Very well," he conceded reluctantly, amidst murmurs of surprise and intrigue among courtiers gathered nearby. "You have 1 minute to prove your accusations." As Thomas was released from his captor's grip, but remained in place near the pillar, he took a deep breath and turned towards the Emperor, with unflinching resolve etched onto his face. Reaching into his tunic pocket, he pulled out several small vials filled with dark liquid that had been procured earlier under strict secrecy. "Your Majesty," Thomas began confidently, while maintaining eye contact, despite knowing full well how trivial such an act appeared to those around him, who saw nothing but a servant boy standing against the might of royal power. "This is what I found." He placed the vials on the ground beside his feet before pulling out another item, a thick ledger filled with financial records showing payments made by Princess Leary, his physician, Kethra Veldraken, over recent months, to an unknown entity for unspecified services rendered. "Kethra has been making regular illegal payments," Thomas continued firmly, holding the book open at key entries. "This doesn't look good for him." The Emperor arched a brow in disbelief, while turning his gaze towards Kethra, who stood trembling beside Princess Lyria's bedchamber door. Fear was evident on his face, though he tried desperately to maintain composure. "Explain yourself, physician," Draken ordered sternly, as Thomas handed over the ledger and vials for closer inspection by palace guards tasked with verifying authenticity of items presented thus far. Kethra bowed deeply, but refused to look directly at Emperor when asked. Explanation demanded urgently from those around him, now demanding answers forthright. "It's all a misunderstanding," Kethra stammered nervously, trying hard not to appear too shaken by sudden turn events, took against his will entirely, without warning or preparation whatsoever. "These are herbs, simple remedies for Princess Leary, his condition, nothing more." Thomas stepped forward once again, though still careful not overstep boundaries set before him given current situation unfolding rapidly out of control according royal decree made mere moments earlier under intense pressure from various factions present here today. "Your Majesty," Thomas interjected quickly while Kethra continued babbling defensively, "my own mother nearly died years ago because she was poisoned by a similar method. It took months for her to recover. Foolish had symptoms almost identical to Princess Lyria's." This revelation brought an immediate hush over courtyard once more as heads turned curiously between Thomas and Kethra. Even Emperor himself seemed slightly taken aback by this new development, complicating matters further amidst already complex web of intrigue being unraveled here today. "Explain yourself," Draken repeated coldly, but with underlying note cautioning against lies or deceit any longer acceptable under scrutiny brought forth upon physician accused directly now based on evidence presented thus far. Thomas could see the fear and desperation in Kithra's eyes as he tried to come up with some sort of explanation, though none seemed forthcoming. "I have seen this before," Thomas persisted calmly, despite mounting pressure bearing down heavily upon him, alone standing here amidst chaos, threatening escalate uncontrollably if left unchecked much longer. Kithra shook his head vehemently, in denial, even while guards began meticulously analyzing contents within vials and comparing them against samples taken from Princess Leary herself over past weeks. Nothing conclusive yet, but clear signs pointing towards sinister truth hidden beneath surface layer of lies spun thickly here today to mask reality far more dangerous lurking unseen behind closed doors. "Father Leary," his voice broke through the tension once again, weak but steady. "Every time I felt better, it was on days Kithra didn't visit." The courtyard seemed to hold its breath at her words, a mix of shock and hope evident in the murmurs that spread quickly among courtiers gathered here. Draken's scales darkened further as he turned his piercing gaze back towards Leary, who nodded gently despite her frailty. "Your Majesty," she continued softly but firmly, addressing everyone present below, "I've been slowly poisoned by Kithra every day." Emperor Draken's expression was unreadable for a moment, torn between loyalty to the family physician and his responsibility as ruler to protect his daughter first. "Bring me proof. Test this medicine," he ordered finally, after another long pause, during which everyone could feel time standing still while awaiting decisive act. Ion needed now more than ever before. Chaos erupted uncontrollably into full-blown crisis, threatening kingdom's stability, outright collapse. Guards moved swiftly with orders given, taking the vials and rushing off towards laboratories deep within palace complex, where skilled alchemists waited anxiously for chance finally present themselves. Test samples brought forward meticulously from scene unfolding here. Tadia, momentous occasion indeed in realm governed by dragons, under threat unseen until now, laid bare starkly before them all. Thomas was left alone near pillar again, chains still waiting menacingly nearby, though unused thus far. He shifted uncomfortably while watching everything unfold rapidly beyond his immediate control, yet somehow feeling strangely at peace, knowing what he had done might just save Princess Leary. After months of suffering endured silently under Kithra's watchful eye, hours felt like days, passing slowly by as Thomas waited anxiously near pillar, chains now securely fastened about waist. Despite recent turn events taken where accusations brought forth proved accurate beyond any doubt, thus far gathered through thorough investigation underway midst chaos threatening erupt uncontrollably if left unchecked much longer, without resolution found quickly before all hope vanished entirely amidst dark web spun tightly around Princess Leary herself. Finally, the guards returned bearing results of analysis conducted upon Kithra's medicine. Samplers spent meticulously examining every detail under microscopic scrutiny until conclusive evidence brought forth clearly proving beyond any shadow doubt sinister truth hidden beneath surface layer lies spun thickly here today, threatening kingdom's very foundation itself unless acted swiftly decisively before all hope vanished entirely amidst dark web spun tightly around Princess Leary herself. Poison, slow acting, undetectable to most alien species, but recognizable by human eyes trained over years' experience recognizing frontier toxins similar those encountered when Thomas' own mother nearly died under circumstances eerily reminiscent present situation threatening kingdom's stability, outright collapse, unless acted swiftly decisively before all hope vanished entirely amidst dark web spun tightly around Princess Lyria herself. Kithra, Emperor Draken spoke suddenly, his voice firm and resolute as he turned towards the quaking physician standing frozen in place. The poison has been found. Thomas felt a wave of relief wash over him at these words, as well as an overwhelming sense of dread, knowing what was to come next given recent revelations brought forth under intense pressure scrutiny faced by all present here today. Amidst complex web intrigue spun thickly behind closed doors, threatening kingdoms' very foundation itself, unless acted swiftly, decisively before chaos erupted uncontrollably into full-blown crisis, vanishing hope entirely midst dark web tightly around Princess Lyria herself. Kethra's entire body seemed to shake violently as he broke down, tears streaming freely from his eyes. I did it," he confessed in a broken whisper that echoed eerily across courtyard, filled suddenly with renewed energy, amidst anticipation awaiting outcome unfolding next, amidst drama playing out before them all under intense pressure scrutiny faced by all present here today. Amidst complex web intrigue spun thickly behind closed doors, threatening kingdom's very foundation itself, unless acted swiftly, decisively before chaos erupted uncontrollably into full-blown crisis, vanishing hope entirely midst dark web tightly around Princess Lyria herself. "Why?" the Emperor demanded coldly, stepping closer to Kithra, who crumbled further under intense scrutiny faced by all present here today. Amidst complex web intrigue spun thickly behind closed doors, threatening kingdom's very foundation itself, unless acted swiftly, decisively before chaos erupted uncontrollably into full-blown crisis, vanishing hope entirely midst dark web tightly around Princess Lyria herself. Duke Vorath. The name slipped from Kethra's lips like a curse, and the courtyard fell silent once more as this new piece of information sent ripples through everyone present gathered here today. Amidst complex web intrigue spun thickly behind closed doors, threatening kingdom's very foundation itself, unless acted swiftly, decisively before chaos erupted uncontrollably into full-blown crisis, vanishing hope entirely midst dark web tightly around Princess Lyria herself. Duke Vorath, Thomas murmured, feeling his blood run cold as the pieces fell into place. The man who had orchestrated this entire scheme was a high-ranking noble with ties to royalty and vast influence within court circles, a formidable foe indeed faced by all present here today. Amidst complex web intrigue spun thickly behind closed doors, threatening kingdom's very foundation itself, unless acted swiftly, decisively before chaos erupted uncontrollably into full-blown crisis, vanishing hope entirely midst dark web tightly around Princess Lyria herself. "Seize Duke Vorath," Emperor Draken commanded sharply, his voice leaving no room for argument as guards moved quickly to carry out orders given without hesitation. Amidst complex web intrigue spun thickly behind closed doors, threatening kingdom's very foundation itself, unless acted swiftly, decisively before chaos erupted uncontrollably into full-blown crisis, vanishing hope entirely midst dark web tightly around Princess Lyria herself. Thomas was freed from his chains and released back into the courtyard, a mix of emotions running through him as he watched events unfold with renewed clarity. The Emperor had been forced to confront the darkness within their ranks, a truth that threatened not just Lyria's life, but the entire kingdom's stability, unless acted swiftly, decisively before chaos erupted uncontrollably into full-blown crisis, vanishing hope entirely midst dark web tightly around Princess Leary herself. "Thank you, Thomas." Leary called out softly from her balcony above as Duke Vorath was being led away by guards amidst complex web intrigue spun thickly behind closed doors, threatening kingdom's very foundation itself, unless acted swiftly, decisively before chaos erupted uncontrollably into full-blown crisis, vanishing hope entirely midst dark web tightly around Princess Leary herself. Thomas nodded, unable to speak for the lump in his throat, as he finally saw justice being served, a moment of triumph amidst tragedy faced by all present here today, amidst complex web intrigue spun thickly behind closed doors, threatening kingdom's very foundation itself, unless acted swiftly, decisively before chaos erupted uncontrollably into full-blown crisis, vanishing hope entirely midst dark web tightly around Princess Leary herself. Andy Cather breaks, confesses everything, names Duke Vorath. The Duke is arrested. Thomas is freed. Thomas sat on a small stool beside Leary's bed, his eyes fixed on her as she stirred awake from another bout of exhaustion. Her copper hair was sprawled messily across the pillows, and her amber eyes fluttered open to meet his warm brown ones. "Good morning," Thomas said with a slight smile, not quite able to hide the weariness in his voice, but determined to stay positive for Leary's sake. Leary smiled back faintly. "Morning." She lifted herself slightly from the bed, using her elbows as support. The color was gradually returning to her scales. They no longer looked so pale and lifeless. Her strength had improved significantly over recent days, thanks in large part to the treatment Thomas discovered beneath her bed. "You look better today," he said honestly. Leary's eyes crinkled at the corners, a small sign of happiness despite her condition. "I do feel better." She paused for a moment before asking quietly, "How is your mother?" Thomas blinked, taken aback by the sudden change in conversation, but grateful for it all the same. "She's doing well," he lied smoothly. The truth was that his mother's health had started to decline again once Thomas had left home and returned to the palace amidst complex web intrigue spun thickly behind closed doors, threatening kingdom's very foundation itself, unless acted swiftly, decisively before chaos erupted uncontrollably into full-blown crisis, vanishing hope entirely midst dark web tightly around Princess Leary herself. But he couldn't worry her with that now. Leary nodded, seeming content with his answer even though she knew something was off. She understood the need for secrecy and support in difficult times. "I wish I could visit your home," she said softly. "It must be a beautiful place." Thomas laughed lightly. "Not exactly a palace or anything," he replied, but her curiosity about human life, especially that of his mother's humble abode, touched him deeply. "Tell me more, Leary," urged gently. So Thomas began to describe their small village on the frontier colony, dusty streets filled with laughter and chatter as families bustled about, children playing tag under the bright sun. He spoke of his mother tending gardens lush with produce she sold at market stalls, along winding paths where old friends shared stories while sipping sweet tea infused with local herbs. Leary listened intently, her eyes sparkling with interest. "It sounds lovely," she murmured wistfully when Thomas paused to catch his breath from the vivid details he painted for her. "Tell me about you then," Thomas suggested softly, after a moment's silence between them had stretched out comfortably enough. He wanted to know more about who Princess Leary truly was beyond the illness that threatened to consume her. Her face softened into a gentle, reflective smile as she thought back on better days before Duke Vorath and his poison began their insidious work. "I grew up in this palace," she started quietly, tracing patterns idly with one finger along an ornate embroidery at the edge of her blankets. "There are stories behind every wall here, legends passed down by ancestors who shaped our world into what it is today." She hesitated briefly before continuing more brightly. "But I like imagining other places too, where children play freely without a care in the world." Thomas nodded thoughtfully, understanding well that she sought escape from her own burdens through flights of fancy and tales woven within these hallowed halls. They spent hours talking about everything under the sun, from dragon culture to human customs, and as each day passed, Thomas found himself increasingly drawn into Lyria's orbit despite knowing he was still just a servant. Yet every morning, when Thomas entered her room with his usual greeting, she insisted that he stay longer and chat until they both lost track of time. The court buzzed endlessly about this unprecedented arrangement between princess and servant, but dared not interfere openly while the emperor remained silent on the matter. Amidst complex web intrigue spun thickly behind closed doors, threatening kingdoms, very foundation itself, unless acted swiftly, decisively before chaos erupted uncontrollably into full-blown crisis, vanishing hope entirely midst dark web tightly around Princess Lyria herself. In fact, it seemed that his gratitude toward Thomas had only grown after learning how close Duke Vorath's poison had come to ending his daughter's life and threatening the stability of their empire. Thomas, one day when he visited her chamber early afternoon, found her sitting up fully in bed now, looking healthier than ever before. "Can you take me for a walk?" she asked eagerly, eyes wide with anticipation at being able to venture beyond her confines again after so long confined within them by both illness and protocol. Amidst complex web intrigue spun thickly behind closed doors, threatening kingdoms, very foundation itself, unless acted swiftly, decisively before chaos erupted uncontrollably into full-blown crisis, vanishing hope entirely midst dark web tightly around Princess Lyria herself. He hesitated only briefly, catching himself considering how inappropriate this must look to onlookers, but seeing the hopeful gleam in her eyes, and remembering his vow to help however he could despite everything else pressing against him right now, Thomas nodded resolutely. "Of course," with a small smile of triumph and gratitude shining bright for just an instant before concern settled back into place once more at thoughts of scrutiny from others around them. Amidst complex web intrigue spun thickly behind closed doors, threatening kingdoms, very foundation itself, unless acted swiftly, decisively before chaos erupted uncontrollably into full-blown crisis, vanishing hope entirely midst dark web tightly around Princess Lyria herself. She thanked him softly and began preparing to leave her room. Hand in hand, they made their way through palace corridors, Lyria walking carefully but steadily now, with Thomas's support close beside her at all times. Amidst complex web intrigue spun thickly behind closed doors, threatening kingdoms, very foundation itself, unless acted swiftly, decisively before chaos erupted uncontrollably into full-blown crisis, vanishing hope entirely midst dark web tightly around Princess Lyria herself. The cool breeze outside felt invigorating against their skin, a stark contrast to the stuffy confines of royal chambers where they had been held for far too long. Amidst complex web intrigue spun thickly behind closed doors, threatening kingdoms, very foundation itself, unless acted swiftly, decisively before chaos erupted uncontrollably into full-blown crisis, vanishing hope entirely midst dark web tightly around Princess Leary herself. "Look at this garden, Leary," he whispered, her voice filled with wonder as they paused near a blooming rosebush. "It's so beautiful." Thomas nodded in agreement, his heart swelling unexpectedly with pride and affection towards the young woman who had been confined for months, yet still managed to find joy amidst such constraints, amidst complex web intrigue spun thickly behind closed doors, threatening kingdoms' very foundation itself, unless acted swiftly, decisively before chaos erupted uncontrollably into full-blown crisis, vanishing hope entirely midst dark web tightly around Princess Leary herself. However, as they continued walking further along winding paths lined with flowers and trees alike, their presence was noticed by more courtiers amidst complex web intrigue spun thickly behind closed doors, threatening kingdoms' very foundation itself, unless acted swiftly, decisively before chaos erupted uncontrollably into full-blown crisis, vanishing hope entirely midst dark web tightly around Princess Leary herself. The air grew tense and uncomfortable as whispers began circulating amongst the gathered nobles about their unprecedented companionship amidst complex web intrigue spun thickly behind closed doors, threatening kingdoms' very foundation itself, unless acted swiftly, decisively before chaos erupted uncontrollably into full-blown crisis, vanishing hope entirely midst dark web tightly around Princess Leary herself. "Thomas, Leary," he said suddenly, stopping in her tracks and pulling him aside gently, away from the prying eyes of those watching them amidst complex web intrigue spun thickly behind closed doors, threatening kingdoms' very foundation itself, unless acted swiftly, decisively before chaos erupted uncontrollably into full-blown crisis, vanishing hope entirely midst dark web tightly around Princess Leary herself. "The court says I should forget you," she confessed quietly, her voice trembling slightly, as if fearing the words she was about to utter might change everything between them amidst complex web intrigue spun thickly behind closed doors, threatening kingdoms' very foundation itself, unless acted swiftly, decisively before chaos erupted uncontrollably into full-blown crisis, vanishing hope entirely midst dark web tightly around Princess Leary herself. He felt his heart sink at her statement, knowing all too well the gravity and implications of such a command amidst complex web intrigue spun thickly behind closed doors, threatening kingdoms' very foundation itself, unless acted swiftly, decisively before chaos erupted uncontrollably into full-blown crisis, vanishing hope entirely midst dark web tightly around Princess Leary herself. But before he could respond with anything more than an unspoken dread weighing heavily in the silence between them amidst complex web intrigue spun thickly behind closed doors, threatening kingdoms' very foundation itself, unless acted swiftly, decisively before chaos erupted uncontrollably into full-blown crisis, vanishing hope entirely midst dark web tightly around Princess Leary herself, she continued firmly yet kindly. "They are wrong," Leary had declared softly, but with unwavering conviction, amidst complex web intrigue spun thickly behind closed doors, threatening kingdoms' very foundation itself, unless acted swiftly, decisively before chaos erupted uncontrollably into full-blown crisis, vanishing hope entirely midst dark web tightly around Princess Leary herself. Thomas Miller stood trembling, his heart racing as he waited for the great iron doors of the throne room to creak open and admit him into its grand expanse. The air was thick with anticipation, heavy with unspoken threats and promises that swirled around like a menacing fog. As Thomas stepped forward nervously, the door groaned on ancient hinges and revealed an immense chamber bathed in golden light from high chandeliers. The Emperor Veldraken sat atop his throne of obsidian stone, a figure imposing even by Drakari standards, broad-shouldered with scales that shimmered like polished copper. His eyes glinted ominously as they locked onto Thomas's form, but strangely, there was no anger or wrath in those piercing amber orbs. Instead, it seemed the Emperor was merely curious. "Thomas Miller," he began, his voice resonating powerfully through the room, "come forth." Heart pounding like a drumroll against his chest, Thomas approached and bowed low before the throne. He expected to be reprimanded for coming too close to Princess Leary, or worse, punished severely enough to break him. "What is it you have done?" the Emperor asked softly, but with an undercurrent of authority that demanded attention. "Why would a mere human servant interfere in matters far above your station?" Thomas raised his head and met the Emperor's gaze without flinching, knowing he could not back down now. His response was firm yet respectful. "Your Majesty, I did nothing more than clean up after Princess Leary, as my duty required. But it just so happened that underneath her bed there lay a vial of poison intended for your daughter." A tense silence filled the room before the Emperor let out a low chuckle, surprising Thomas with its warmth and sincerity. "You are clever," he mused aloud, "but also fortunate. You could have stumbled into danger far beyond your ability to handle." Thomas nodded cautiously, but couldn't help his smile. Perhaps there was hope after all for this unlikely savior role of his. "And now?" the Emperor inquired, leaning forward slightly with interest sparking in those vertical pupils. Now Thomas began hesitantly before finding courage within himself. "Now I humbly request an audience to speak freely about what happened under that princess's bed." The Emperor waved a hand dismissively towards him, then turned his gaze elsewhere thoughtfully while pondering over this new information brought by the servant boy who dared challenge royal norms. "Very well," he said finally, dismissing Thomas with another wave of dismissal. "Proceed when you feel ready to do so, but know that prying too far into matters not meant for your eyes can carry grave consequences." Taking a deep breath and steeling himself against any possible outcome, Thomas began his tale from the day Leary. His symptoms started worsening until he discovered what truly lay beneath her bed. He spoke of how she confided in him about strange dreams haunting her sleep, each night growing darker than before as shadows seemed to take shape around them. And then one morning, Thomas concluded, "I noticed something odd on my rowdy how Princess Leary." His discarded handkerchiefs were slightly discolored near the edges. "It led me straight back to that cursed vial under her bed." The Emperor listened intently throughout this entire recounting of events, his expression shifting between skepticism and growing realization at every turn. "And so," Thomas finished quietly, "what do you wish from me? Should I go on cleaning Princess Leary his quarters as though nothing has changed, or should there be justice served for those who would harm her?" For a moment it seemed the Emperor might strike him down right then. Instead, he merely rose slowly to his feet and circled around Thomas with an air of deliberate purpose. "You have acted bravely," he said finally, "and perhaps foolishly, but also with honor towards your charge." Thomas couldn't help but feel a mix of relief and uncertainty as the Emperor moved closer until standing mere inches away from him, so close that their breaths mingled softly between them. Then came another unexpected laugh, one rich enough to sound almost friendly amidst those ominous surroundings. "You could have asked for anything," he said, his voice lowering into something akin to admiration now mixed thoroughly with bemusement. "Wealth beyond measure, power unimaginable within grasp." But Thomas shook his head resolutely without hesitation or pause. "Your Majesty, I don't want riches. I just want my mother to get the same treatment that saved the princess. The best healers, please." The Emperor stared at him, eyes widening slightly before breaking out into full laughter, a sound warm and surprising against this grandiose backdrop of stone and shadow. "You could have asked for a kingdom," he said between bouts of mirthless chuckles still echoing through the vast chamber walls around them. "You asked for your mother." And so it was that after dismissing Thomas with an unusual amount of respect, the Emperor granted him everything promised, not only royal care, but also ensuring that his aging parent would receive top medical attention inside palace grounds from here on. When he emerged back out into daylight once more, still reeling slightly from all recent revelations and developments, there stood Leary, awaiting outside under arching porticos dripping with emerald vines. She beckoned him closer, eagerly yet respectfully, at once recognizing the gravity behind why he'd been summoned inside alone moments earlier. "What did they say?" she whispered anxiously as soon as Thomas stepped close enough to hear her voice without straining his ears amidst bustling courtiers around them. But rather than speaking immediately, Thomas paused first to look deeply into those expressive amber eyes staring back up at him expectantly. There was so much courage yet fragility behind every glance exchanged between them, each one telling tales of hope reborn after darkness threatened to consume all alike here within these sacred halls belonging solely to Drakari nobles. Then finally he answered, "They believe what I told about that poison being under your bed, and have granted my request for mother's care along with everything else promised." Leary, he let out a sigh of relief mixed thoroughly with gratitude, wrapping her arms tightly around his waist in an embrace far too close for propriety, but entirely necessary given current circumstances threatening their bond. "I'm so glad," she murmured against his chest where heartbeat raced steady under layers worn fabric. However, before Thomas could fully reciprocate the gesture back by holding her closer still himself, Leary pulled away gently and stepped back, looking up at him with wide-eyed determination etched across delicate features now glowing softer than ever in contrast to sunbeams filtering through trees above them. "A man who asks for his mother when offered a kingdom, that's the kind of person I want beside me," she stated firmly, her voice no longer trembling, but filled instead with resolve stronger perhaps even than what he'd shown thus far throughout all challenges faced together, so far between their two worlds apart until now. Before Thomas could protest further about social standing or propriety codes dictating forbidden relationships among different species altogether, Leary silenced him effectively by pressing a gentle kiss upon his lips, sweet and fleeting yet resonant enough to remind both parties involved exactly why rules sometimes must bend under weight of true hearts willing to transcend ordinary confines for love's sake. "Let them talk," she whispered against skin still warm from her touch lingering there briefly. "I'm a dragon princess who was saved by a servant looking where no one else bothered seeing." 1 year later, what had once seemed an impossible pairing between human and Drakari now stood realized. Amidst grand ceremony held under open skies draped in silken banners fluttering lightly against crisp autumn air currents carrying scents of newly fallen leaves. Thomas Miller did not stand merely as a humble servant anymore, but rather as royal consort to Princess Leary, a Veldraken who ruled alongside him over their unified kingdom with grace and wisdom far beyond mere mortal boundaries anyone could ever have imagined conceivable just months ago, when shadows first loomed menacingly, threatening all hope remaining within palace walls themselves. And amidst joyous celebration shared among nobles, guests from afar alongside closest family members, especially those deemed dearest, like mothers, sent healing prayers, along with loving tears streaming down faces, flushed bright pink under warm rays shining upon them. Now, when asked how a simple servant managed to win over such an esteemed dragon princess's heart amidst complex web intrigue spun thickly behind closed doors, threatening kingdom's very foundation itself, everyone turned towards Thomas and his mother, sitting together side by side, within front row seating reserved especially for those honored guests. He looked where no one else bothered. She answered simply yet powerfully, enough to ring true throughout audience assembled there listening closely, and he saw what others ignored completely. Thus began a new era, not only marked celebration of love overcoming odds, but also reminder never underestimate humble beginnings when paired together with unyielding willpower, standing shoulder to shoulder against forces seeking destruction from both without and within. With that final note resonating through halls filled now, laughter, cheers rising high along winds carry a message far beyond borders set between worlds apart, until such times as stories like these proved otherwise, true tales weaving threads of hope amidst darkness, ever present, lurking threateningly close, but never quite managing to extinguish light completely when there were those willing brave enough stand against it undaunted regardless cost.